The Transportation Safety Board of Canada has released their preliminary report on the crash of the Endeavour CRJ at Toronto Pearson Airport February 17th. Let's go over the report on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada has released their report on the dramatic crash of Endeavour Air in Toronto. In addition to security cameras, a passenger on a private jet managed to film the landing, which resulted in the fiery crash in which every single person thankfully survived. Let's open up the report and see what it has to say. There are some new and interesting data in this report. Okay, on Thursday, March 20th, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada released the prelim report of the February 17 crash of Delta Airlines 4819 operated by subsidiary Endeavour Air. The flight originated from Minneapolis with 76 passengers and 4 crew members. The aircraft was a Bombardier CL-600 2D-24, the regional jet series 900. CRJ-900. The report begins with the overview. During the landing to runway 23, the aircraft impacted the runway, the right wing detached, and a fire ensued. The aircraft overturned and slid down the runway inverted, coming to rest near the intersection of runway 23 and runway 15 left. All passengers and crew evacuated. Prior to the landing, everything was uneventful to 150 feet above the runway. It was a normal approach. The first officer was the pilot flying the plane. The captain was the pilot monitoring and working radios. The crew received clearance for the ILS approach to runway 23. The landing reference speed, called VREF, for the approach was 139 knots. According to Endeavour's manual for the CRJ-900, final approach is flown at VREF plus 5 knots. When operating in gusty wind conditions, you increase VREF by 1/2 of the gust factor not to exceed 10 knots indicated. On the accident flight, the flight crew set the speed bug to VREF plus 5 or 144 knots. And given the reported wind gusts, the approach was flown at 149 knots. At 2:12 and 1 second, the aircraft descended through 500 feet above ground level. Speed was 150 knots, engine thrust at approximately 64% N1. The first officer disconnected the autopilot, very standard at this point. The rate of descent was 720 feet per minute. Localizer and glide slope were centered, so everything was normal at 500 feet. At 2:12 and 26 seconds, the aircraft descended through 175 feet and was at 144 knots. The rate of descent was 672 feet per minute. Everything still very normal for landing. 4 seconds later, 153 feet, airspeed increased to 154 knots with ground speed remaining unchanged. This is indicative of a gust, a right quartering gust. The report uses the words, quote, performance increasing wind gust, and this is important. The first officer pulled back the thrust levels and over the next 5 seconds decreased from 64% to 43% where it remained until touchdown. And this is where the problem occurred. On the backside of a wind gust, all the performance increased can become performance decreased. And if you've pulled back the power, you will increase your sink rate. You've lost a bunch of lift. At 2:12 and 40 seconds, which was 3.6 seconds before touchdown, the aircraft was at 50 feet and airspeed 145 knots. The rate of descent increased to 1,114 feet per minute. The enhanced ground proximity warning system, Oral Alert 50, sounded. And 1 second later, the EGPWS alert sink rate sounded, indicating a high rate of sink. Airspeed was 136 knots. Now, the aircraft was significantly below glide slope, but tracking centerline. The rate of descent was 1,072 feet per minute, and bank angle was 5.9 degrees to the right. In less than 1 second before touchdown, Aircraft indicated speed was 134 knots and bank angle increased to 7.1 degrees to the right, and the pitch attitude was only 1 degree nose up. And the rate of descent was 1,110 feet per minute. At 2:12 and 43 seconds, the right main landing gear contacted the runway. The aircraft was in a 7.5 degree bank to the right with a 1 degree nose up and a 3G vertical acceleration at the rate of 1,098 feet per minute. They landed with 3 Gs on the right gear only. A hard landing on both gear is 2.6 Gs. When only one gear takes it all, it's easy to see why the right gear may have failed. And here's what the report goes on to read. At touchdown, the following occurred. The side stay that is attached to the right main landing gear fractured. The landing gear folded into the retracted position. The wing root fractured between the fuselage and the landing gear, and the wing detached from the fuselage, releasing a cloud of jet fuel which caught fire. The aircraft slid along the runway, the fuselage rolling to the right until it was inverted. A large portion of the tail, including most of the vertical stabilizer and the entire horizontal stabilizer, became detached during the roll. And once the aircraft stopped, an evacuation began, and 21 of the 80 were injured, 2 seriously injured. All recovered. Quite the miracle. Here's what the report says about the flight crew. The captain worked for Endeavor since October of 2007. He is employed as a flight crew member and a simulator instructor. At the time of the crash, he had 3,570 hours of total flight time, including 764 hours in the CRJ-900. This flight was his first flight of the day and the first flight in preceding 7 days. In the previous 7 days, he had worked 3 days as an instructor, presumably in the sims. Over the last 30 days, he had flown 3.5 hours. Now, for the first officer, she had been hired by Endeavor in January of 2024. At the time of the crash, she had 1,422 total hours of flying, including 418.7 hours on the 900. She had flown 56.3 hours in the previous 30 days. The report says she holds an airline transport pilot certificate issued by the FAA. But you can't hold an ATP certificate until you've reached 1,500 total hours. This means she actually had a restricted ATP certificate, which is common for pilots coming out of aviation degreed universities. A 4-year aviation university allows you to be hired at 1,000 hours, which by the math is about right for the first officer in this case. And while I previously reported on the restricted ATP, one note I failed to mention last time is that the first officer will generally not remove the restricted from their ATP until a captain upgrade because it requires a check ride. And a restricted ATP simply means you can't be pilot in command, which a first officer is not going to be anyway. However, we now know the first officer was not yet at the 1,500-hour threshold. In my research, I found that regional pilots will work on average 600 to 800 hours a year, and the max is 1,000 hours anyway. With the captain working for almost 18 years and having only 3,570 hours, it makes sense that he primarily works as a sim instructor. And to keep current, you need to occasionally fly, and he was doing that on this flight. Then the report talks about the plane, which was manufactured in 2008 and had 35,335 total airframe hours. Nothing unusual here. And then the weather. At 2 p.m., the winds were 270 from due west at 28 knots, gusting 35 knots. They landed runway 23, so that's a 40-degree crosswind. The report does not mention what the max crosswind component for Endeavor for the first officer with her flight experience. Visibility was 6 statute miles and blowing snow. Temperature was -9 Celsius. And the report goes on to mention the flight manual indicates to initiate a flare between 30 to 20 feet. The pitch attitude at touchdown should be between 3 and 8 degrees depending on the VREF. Also, it defines a hard landing as a vertical descent rate greater than 600 feet per minute when aircraft's gross weight is less than or equal to max landing weight. And then the report goes into the right main landing gear side stay. This was the point of failure, and it has been quarantined for further examination. And the big question here that they'll look at is whether the side stay was damaged previously or had been fractured, or if the 3G landing was enough to fracture the side stay. The report goes on to talk about the evacuation. Some injuries happened when passengers unbuckled and fell to the ceiling. And the flight crew evacuated through an escape hatch on the cockpit ceiling, which was near the ground. One interesting bit of news: after passengers and crews evacuated, first responders entered the fuselage, and shortly thereafter, an explosion occurred outside the aircraft in the area of the left wing root. The cause of this explosion has not yet been determined. Also of note, there was another company pilot and cabin crew member who were repositioning and sitting as passengers, and they were able to assist with the evacuation. So it was great having extra help there in the cabin. And it was a great job by the cabin crew and those crew members repositioning to get everyone out safe. Again, just a miracle all around that everyone survived this crash. Also, they do have the cockpit voice recorder, but have not released any information on what it contains. And lastly, I want to emphasize, while the first officer was the pilot flying, the captain was the pilot in command, and ultimately, it's his responsibility for the flight. That's our report on the Delta Airline 4816 crash in Toronto. Thanks for watching, and thanks to our sponsors like FlyingEyesOptics.com. We're using our discount code TAKINGOFF, all caps, one word, will get you 10% off. These really are the best glasses under helmets and headsets. Look how thin those are. Also, Clemens Insurance. As a broker, they go to bat for me to get me the best rate with the underwriters. You can contact them at clemensinsurance.net. And if you like hardcore aviation, check out our sister channel in the hangar right there. And finally, if you found this report useful, check out our other recent report right here. Thanks again, take care, and remember, superior judgment trumps superior skills. Stay safe.